This airport shouldn't exist. It sits 2,200 meters above sea level, deep in the Himalayas, surrounded by steep mountain walls. No flat terrain, no room for error. Most engineers wouldn't even attempt to build a road here. Yet somehow, an international airport was carved into this mountaintop. But the real problem wasn't building it. It was landing a plane here. This is the story of Bhutan's impossible airport. Long before planes landed here, Bhutan was one of the hardest countries on Earth to reach. Anyone trying to enter the country had to make their way through some of the tallest mountains on the planet. No highways, no railways, just narrow paths winding through the Himalayas for days, sometimes weeks. The mountains protected Bhutan, but eventually they became a problem. The country wanted to grow, more trade, more visitors, better connections to the outside world. But for that, Bhutan needed something it barely had. A large, flat piece of land for an airport. And that's where the real problem began. Because almost every location in the country was unsuitable. Almost everyone. Until engineers finally found a site. A site most people would have ruled out immediately. That place was the Paro Valley. A narrow patch of land deep in the Himalayas, surrounded by mountains, hemmed in by steep slopes. The kind of place most engineers would rule out immediately. But it had one thing no one could ignore. Space. Not much, but enough. For the first time, an airport seemed possible. Then, the surveys came back, and they revealed a problem. The mountains weren't just high, they were dangerously close. Every decision mattered. Every meter, every turn, every mistake. They had found a location. Now, they had to figure out how to build an airport in a place like this. Finding a location was one thing. Building an airport, there was something else entirely. The Paro Valley offered just enough room, but only just. Mountains on one side, a river on the other. There was no room to waste. Every meter mattered. Engineers couldn't simply build the airport they wanted. They had to build the airport the landscape would allow. And that changed everything. The runway had to fit inside a narrow valley. The terminal had to fit into the little space available. Even future expansion would be difficult. But space wasn't the biggest challenge. The terrain was. The ground was never meant for an airport. Areas had to be leveled, reinforced, stabilized, again and again. Because a runway leaves no room for error. A small crack can become a major problem. A weak foundation can become a disaster. Every layer had to be tested. Every surface had to be inspected. Every decision had to be right. But while engineers were dealing with those challenges, another problem was becoming impossible to ignore. The mountains surrounding the airport. Because once construction was finished, pilots would have to fly through them. And that created a problem that couldn't be solved with concrete. Building an airport is difficult. Getting to the site was even harder. The roads were narrow. The turns were tight. The mountains were unforgiving. Every truck had to fight its way through the Himalayas. Meter by meter, turn by turn. Heavy machinery had to be brought in, along with thousands of tons of construction materials. Because without materials, there would be no airport, no runway, no terminal, nothing. With each passing day, the construction site grew. More workers, more machines, more equipment. Slowly, the valley began to change. But getting materials to the site was only half the battle. The hardest part was still ahead. Now they had to turn this valley into an airport. And that's where the next challenge began. Construction went on for months. The airport slowly took shape. The runway came first, then the buildings. In the end, everything seemed ready. But there was one problem, and nobody could remove it. Not with excavators, not with concrete, not with money. The mountains. They were still there, right next to the airport. Towering above the valley and dangerously close. For the engineers, it was frustrating. For the pilots, it would be much worse. Because landing in Paro isn't just about finding the runway. First, you have to find a way through the mountains. And from this point on, every second matters. The airport was finished. But now it had to prove it could actually work. The landing. At most airports, pilots can see the runway from miles away. Not in Paro. Here, the mountains block the view, The valley decides the path. And every turn has to be perfect. Too early, too late, too far left, too far right. One mistake is all it takes. That's why only specially trained pilots are allowed to land here. Pilots who know the valley by heart. Every turn, every landmark, every section of the approach. Because the runway doesn't appear until the very last moment. After the mountains, after the turns, after the most critical seconds of the flight. And that's what makes this airport so remarkable. Not the runway, not the terminal, not the buildings, but the fact that it works at all. Deep in the Himalayas, surrounded by towering mountains, in a place most engineers would have ruled out from the very beginning, and in a place where most pilots will never land. Even today, pilots approaching Paro for the first time often find themselves asking the same question. Who thought it was a good idea to build an airport here?